and welcome to another episode of The Uncover Up. I'm one of your co hosts, Lee Kuhnle, and with me, as always, is Nathan Radke. Hi, Nathan.
Hey, how's it going? This
Good.
is one of those episodes that's going to be both sound and sight.
Sound
Because
and
if you
sight.
want to, we're going to be putting this on YouTube. Again, if you want to see what we look like and the weird faces that we make as we're talking.
Yeah, that's right. You see
Like the
how
one that
our
Lee's making right now.
how our voices totally don't match our faces at all,
And also,
which is
this is a very visual episode because we're talking about a photograph.
That's right, but only really about one photograph in particular. So if
Hmm.
you are consuming this as a traditional podcast, don't worry, we've got you. We will describe what is in this one relatively straightforward picture.
Yeah, unfortunately, because a picture is worth 1,000 words, we'll probably use approximately 1,000 words to describe.
I'll use at least that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's
Oh,
get into it, right?
this is a UFO episode,
Hmm.
so I'm very pleased.
Me too.
I love the UFO episodes, I think, almost as much as I love the cryptids.
I definitely, for me, UFO is number one.
More so than Sasquatch.
Oh, Sasquatch is a personal favorite of mine, but as a topic, I think UFOs is definitely number one, followed by all the stuff in disinformation and political conspiracies.
Yeah,
But
good,
I
good,
mean,
strong second choice.
UFOs have got it all.
Yeah,
They've got potentially government cover ups, and
yep,
they've got just your classic sci fi stuff.
yeah.
And they've
Weird
got,
tech.
yes,
The
weird tech.
interaction between pop culture and mythology
Exactly.
and conspiracy.
Exactly. They've just got it all. The
Hmm.
Calvine incident in 1990 in Scotland, that's one that we haven't talked about, but it's a big deal.
Yeah, we've been sort of ignoring the UK this whole time,
Yeah, we have been.
despite the fact that there's been a number of UK-related UFO incidents. One of the most famous, of course, being the Rendlesham Forest encounter,
Okay.
December of 1980.
Okay.
Which maybe we'll do a whole episode on.
I guess so.
Interestingly, despite this happening at an RAF base, a Royal Air Force base, and involving RAF service members, Rendlesham wasn't considered a matter of national defense, so it wasn't investigated by the Ministry of Defense, by the MOD. The
Hmm.
incident we're looking at today was investigated by the MOD.
Yeah.
And in addition, as you said, it's been called the best UFO picture ever seen by the ordinarily very sober and serious Guardian newspaper.
What happens in August of 1990 to begin this story?
Okay, so let me take you out to the moors. Now, what moors are, they're hilly areas in Scotland covered by low vegetation, like
Okay.
shrubs.
Okay.
So we're out at the moors. It's kind of hazy, it's a bit cloudy, it's a bit Scottish.
You're in what seems like a very rural place or
Hmm.
bucolic place.
Yeah, not a very busy place. It's
Yeah.
also not a very busy era for UFO sightings. It's not like the early 50s or the late 70s or the mid 90s. And also when this occurs, because I think you always have to talk about this when you're talking about anything UFO related, there hadn't been much in pop culture about UFOs for a few years either when this happens.
Right.
Right? So it takes place in an isolated place, also sort of takes place in an isolated time UFO wise.
Yeah, that's a good point to remember because sometimes we've seen flaps, as they're known, these kind of this upsurge in public interest in UFOs corresponding with certain kinds of events. One of the first ones being Kenneth Arnold's sighting of what is, I guess, the first modern UFO story. And then suddenly after that, they start flooding in. Now, we
It's
don't
everywhere.
seem to have any of that stuff going on. There's
Yeah, not
nothing,
much, not much going on.
no UFO stuff going on.
And so here's the story of the incident. We've got two hikers. They're walking through the moors, past the low vegetation, like shrubs. And what they're doing, we'll come back to, I think, later in the episode as far as
They're
what,
hiking, you
yeah,
said.
they're hiking. We'll see what
They're
they're actually up
hiking.
to.
Okay.
Now suddenly these two men become aware of something in the sky above them. And they look up, and what they see is a large diamond shape, about the size of, say, a jet fighter. And
Hmm.
it's hovering in the sky, and it's making no perceptible noise.
Okay.
And allegedly, these two men then just hit the ground and take cover under some low vegetation, like
Right.
shrubs. And the two men hit the ground, and then there's a loud noise as a British Aerospace Harrier attack jet approached
Okay.
the diamond-shaped UFO and started circling it.
Hmm.
It's doing a few circles around the UFO, and as this is happening, the hikers take out their camera and take 6 photographs of this scene.
Okay.
And And then the UFO takes off vertically and disappears, and the Harrier takes off, and the two men find themselves alone in the moors with surrounded by low vegetation, like
Now,
shrubs.
we are going to spend a lot of time learning about this photograph, but is this a good time maybe just to give, especially the podcast listeners, a quick summary of what's in the image?
Yeah, I think let's talk about this image now. Now, for the people watching this on YouTube, we don't have the rights to show the image, and so we've had our artistic director Sherry Palm draw like a remarkable facsimile of it, and we'll put that up right now.
Thanks,
And so
Sherry.
so now let's talk about what's in this picture. So the
Okay.
majority of the photograph is taken up with what appears to be a gray and cloudy sky, very Scottish weather. That's most of the picture.
Hmm.
In the center of the photograph, we see a strange diamond shape, as seen from the side. It's flattened, it's much longer than it is tall.
Hmm.
Now, below the UFO, and appearing to be further away than it as well, is a blurry image of an aircraft that appears to be a Harrier jet in motion.
Hmm.
It's very small in the photo and it's blurry, but the proportions are correct for it to be a Harrier. At the bottom of the photograph is what looks like a barbed wire fence in the foreground, and at the top of the photograph are some hanging branches from what must be a tree, which is a form of tall vegetation, like an elongated shrub.
So that's the image. This was apparently one of six, but this
Mhm.
is the one, the one that we're describing. It's the one that's reproduced in a bunch of newspaper and magazine articles, including The Guardian, which we've cited. It is, but the rest of them are apparently similar to this as well. Sorry, that was BB has figured out how to open doors. I think we need to also just talk about what happens to these photos, which are, as you have said, considered potentially some of the best photographic evidence for UFOs.
Yeah. So let's get into this photograph then.
Yeah.
At the time this happens, there's a press officer working for the British military named Craig Lindsay.
Hmm.
He's at the nearby Petrevie Castle RAF base, and he gets contacted by a Scottish newspaper named the Daily Record,
Hmm.
and they've got this weird story for him. And the story is that these hikers who we were talking about at the beginning, they sent the newspaper six photographs and gave the story that we just told.
Right.
And so then he sees this one photograph that the newspaper sends him. They send him what they consider to be the best one, which is the one that we're looking at and the one that people
Hmm.
have seen. And he looks at it and he's like, "Man, what the heck is happening here? Like, what is this?"
So then Lindsay sends these photographs on to the MOD, or the Ministry of Defense. And we were talking briefly before we went on air today that this is not at all an unusual practice, that any self respecting military organization would take seriously incursions into its airspace that it's not aware of, or potential threats in its airspace. So if you are being sent pictures by civilians that say, hey, look, there's something in our airspace, this is the kind of thing you might want to look into, because who knows what it could be. And of course, we had that incident, I think it's 2 years ago now, Nathan, when we had what might have been Chinese spy balloons coming into Canadian and American airspace. And that's this kind of issue, right? Where
Mhm.
you are presented with something you don't know what it is out there. It is then technically a UFO, right? It's an unidentified flying object.
And the Ministry of Defense is interested in this, and they tell Lindsay, "Okay, listen, contact the Daily Record, get the other five pictures, get the negatives, and send them along to the MOD offices." And they also
All
asked Lindsay to contact the hikers and
exactly,
get their story.
exactly. So, and that's what he does. And yet it sort of goes away, as a lack of a better way of putting it,
Yeah, I
right?
mean,
Is
despite the fact that the picture itself is pretty compelling and the story is sort of interesting, the Daily Record, that newspaper, never runs the story.
does not publish it.
And the MOD tells Lindsay, "Listen, we're going to handle this."
Yeah.
And then he doesn't hear anything else about
Yeah.
it from the
And of
MOD.
course, he probably assumes that they have handled it, whatever that might mean. Go talk to
Yeah.
the people, or maybe it was a weather balloon, or, whatever the kinds of things might be. I'm if I'm Craig Lindsay, I'm not necessarily expecting a phone call from the MOD giving me a
Right.
rundown with all the top secret stuff that they've
No,
discovered.
not really how the military works. However, it is interesting that later that same year, in the fall of that year, Lindsay was at the MOD offices for a meeting, and he's walking around the grounds, and he sees something familiar in an office because there was a giant poster-sized print of that first photograph up on a wall.
Yeah, yeah,
And so Lindsay's able to talk to some of the specialists who had examined those photos, who told him that, well, there's no evidence that the picture was a hoax, but they also had no idea what the diamond shape was. Like, what is
yeah.
this thing? And then that photograph basically stays out of the public eye for 32 years. So we mentioned that 1990 wasn't a big time for UFOs, but the mid 90s were a big time for UFOs. 1993, we had Fire in the Sky, which was a fairly popular movie that was based on the Travis Walton incident. Travis Walton, of course, claimed to have been kidnapped by aliens in the 1970s. We have an episode on it. 1993, of course, what show debuts?
It is the X-Files. And
Exactly.
then you also have on Fox, you have the big alien autopsy
Yep.
event, which was it was interesting. It was one of the this kind of tabloid media news event where it skirted the line between clearly fiction but pretending to be real, where a supposed alien corpse potentially maybe dissected in the laboratory somewhere in Area 51, that footage, quote unquote, was leaked. And this was now shown on Fox as this big reveal. I remember being
Right.
very excited about it
Oh,
in
me too.
95. Yeah,
Yeah, even though it was completely irresponsible and obviously faked. Also,
obviously faked.
also in the mid 90s and 96, we have Independence Day.
Mm-hmm.
Huge film, massive film about an alien invasion. There's a 1996 TV show called Dark Skies about an alien invasion. England had an animal mutilation scare in 1993.
Okay.
And so, in amidst all of that, there's a new character that shows up in the story.
Okay.
So, in the early 90s, there was a guy called Nick Pope, and he had been working for the MOD department, which investigated UFO sightings,
Mm-hmm.
Section 2A,
Okay.
Sec 2A. And in 1996, he publishes his book, Open Skies, Closed Minds.
All right.
And this is an important book. And he laments, because we have a government insider who'd been working at Sec 2A, and he laments the fact that UFO sightings weren't treated with openness and honesty by governments, which is
Mm-hmm.
something that I think we would agree with.
Sure.
That this is an important thing. Governments have been unbelievably untransparent, and even to the point of, again, pushing disinformation, discrediting people, like launching personal attacks on people who came forward to say they saw things. This
Yeah,
is like classic, going all the way back to Project Grudge and Project Saucer in the
totally.
40s and 50s.
I mean, I know that this is my hobby horse, and I'm just going to get on it and ride it a little bit right now, which is to say that the government's a big thing, and it usually doesn't operate as a coherent unit. And so you can at the same time have elements of the government dismissing this, even elements of the same department, say, for example, Air Force intelligence, saying there's nothing to see here, while at the same time doing disinformation campaigns, while at the same time also kind of secretly taking it quite seriously.
Right, because there's going to be
So,
some people that are like, damn, I think it's aliens. At,
or
at,
it could be
or the
foreign
Soviets.
adversarial tech of some
Yeah,
sort, or who knows, right? So I I agree on the one hand that I think in public discourse we need to destigmatize our discussions around UFOs, UAPs, especially have avenues for pilots to come forward in ways that don't tarnish their reputations, but also have maybe organizations like NASA be the ones responsible for analyzing this stuff and it not always being a question of military purview, and then also with the limits of their tech. They have really great tech for blowing things up. They don't necessarily always have the best tech for analysis.
yeah,
So I would agree with that in particular, that we need to kind of really take this phenomenon a lot more seriously in the public discourse and kind of governments facing the public.
yeah. And so, completely reasonable position. Now, as far as Pope's analysis of some famous UFO encounters, I think if you read it, you would find yourself disagreeing with a lot of his interpretations. The Mantell incident, of course, where we had a fighter pilot in the late 40s sent up after a UFO that a bunch of people clearly saw and was clearly in the sky and crashed and was killed. There was a cover up by the American Air Force who said he was chasing Venus when Venus wasn't in the sky. This was like a fundamental part of the introduction of UFO into American consciousness. And our interpretation of that is, and also Captain Ruppelt's interpretation of that in Blue Book, and just the reasonable interpretation, that was a skyhook balloon that he was chasing, top secret project. That's why the American Air Force lied about it. And also
So
why the witnesses described it as looking like an upside down teardrop that was metallic.
what Nathan is describing is a sort of litmus test for how he feels about UFO authors and checking what their take is on some of the obviously debunked major historical UFO incidents. So
Mhm.
we know what happened with the Captain Mantell incident.
We're pretty certain.
I mean, if I had to bet money on it, I
Yep.
would confidently bet money on it not being an extraterrestrial flying craft, but rather some piece of a secret project. Now,
Mhm.
armed with this kind of knowledge, we know what we think happened with Mantell. We know what we think happened with Betty and Barney Hill. We know what we think about Adamski or Gray Barker. And so Nathan's process, if I can describe it on your behalf, Nathan, is to sort of get this book, go to the index, take a look at where these things are mentioned in the book, and then see what they write about it. And
Yeah, exactly.
if they're very credulous, then we know that they are in the believer camp and they are not necessarily being as critical as they need to be.
Yeah. And so with Mantell, with the Roswell incident, with characters like Bob Lazar, who we don't think that highly of. I mean, in the book, Pope even sort of gives some leeway to Adamski, who, in my mind and in your mind, is just a hilariously inept scammer who
Yeah,
was trying to cash in on the UFO craze in the
yeah,
1950s.
yeah.
So
So Pope is kind of a proselytizer, I
yeah,
guess you might say, of
I wouldn't call him a scammer. I wouldn't say that he's
no,
being dishonest, but he
but
is
he
coming from the
believes,
position. He is a believer, and that does, I think, affect the way that he sees. And his position has also changed over the years since this book came out. So Nick Pope's book is the first time I can find that Calvine is mentioned to the public. And he talks about it, it's about halfway through. He mentions the Calvine incident. He says that he had a blow up of the photograph on his office wall,
mm,
which means that that blow up that Lindsay had seen when he was at the MOD seems entirely likely that he saw Nick Pope's blow up. So Pope introduces Calvine the into the
the,
consciousness at a time when interest in UFOs is also starting to peak. And so again, when we talk about how a myth is created, how a story is created, this is an aspect of that. And so then the next thing that happens is we're going to get a fairly, I think, serious and careful uh, professor who's going to examine this in a more critical way, and that's really where this story starts to come to the modern day.
it makes a big splash in 2022. This is when it all gets rediscovered. And that story is maybe worth just briefly recounting as well. It comes down to a Professor David Clark.
And in 2009, Dr. Clark was curating the release of all of the Ministry of Defense UFO files for the National Archive, and he comes across a poor quality photocopy of one of the Calvine photographs.
And there's a note on it as well to the, I think it was like the Thatcher government, sort of an internal memo that was like, we don't actually know what this is.
Mm-hmm.
This piques Clark's interest, and he keeps, wanting to find out more about it, but it isn't until 2018 where, and this I found this quite illuminating or interesting because longtime listeners of the Uncover Up will be familiar with these kinds of bureaucratic mistakes that then eventually reveal a secret.
Right.
And
Well, I mean, that's how so much MK Ultra stuff came out. Somebody
exactly,
misfiled something.
exactly. I was thinking, Nathan, exactly of the MK Ultra example. It turns out that there are names associated with the photo, one in particular, that haven't been redacted by the Ministry of Defense, the MOD. And so this gives Professor Clark an in into the investigation.
And of course, the other thing that he comes across when he's looking through these files is there's attached to the memo, there's a page titled Defensive Lines to Take,
Hmm.
which is interesting. It had been written up as instructions for government officials when they interacted with the press about this story.
Right.
They're
Right.
like, okay,
It was
guys,
for
the
the
press.
Thatcher government, right?
Yeah, exactly. We're
Yeah.
like, okay, the press is going to want your like blurb on this. Here's what you say. You say
Yeah.
there's no definite conclusions reached on what the object is. The aircraft is a Harrier. There's no record of any Harriers operating at that alleged location at that time on that date, and there's no other reports of unusual air activity. And so this also piques his interest. And the other name that he comes across, of course, is the press officer, Craig Lindsay, who had first been contacted by the Daily Record. And so this gives Clark someone to be like, ooh, this is an avenue into the story. I can go talk to Lindsay.
Exactly. And this again is from the Guardian article we've cited a couple of times. When he contacts Lindsay, Lindsay supposedly says, I've been waiting for someone to call me about this for 30 years.
Right.
And not only that, Lindsay is able to actually find a copy of the photograph in his files that he had just sort of put away, I think somewhere
In
between
his
like,
garage.
yeah, in a book, somewhere.
Yeah. Just
And
we all know that feeling going out to a garage and just going through piles and piles of boxes looking for one
yeah,
thing.
exactly. And gives this photo to Clark.
Yeah.
And so now Clark, though, has a guy named Andrew Robinson analyze and authenticate the image.
So we are now very pleased to welcome the senior lecturer in photography at Sheffield Hallam University and co-founder of the Center for Contemporary Legend, Andrew Robinson. Andrew, thanks for joining us.
No problem. I'm happy to be here.
So I'm very excited to have an expert in photography on this story because, of course, this story is driven so heavily by this photograph. Before we get into the specifics of it, could you give us a little bit of your professional background?
Okay, I've been involved in photography since the late 80s, about 1987, 88. I originally studied for an MA in photography at the Royal College of Art in London. I then worked freelance for a period of time in London, during which I worked for a specialist photographic supplier, and I did like materials testing and equipment testing there. So I was sort of doing technical related stuff. And after a period of about 5 years, I moved north and I began to teach for half of my week, and the other half of my week I was involved in more arts-related projects, arts commissions, publications, exhibitions, and things like that. And then probably for the last sort of 15 years or so, I've been teaching full-time, teaching photography on a BA and an MA course. And I guess a particular interest of mine is the manner in which photographs can act as visual evidence. And it's quite, the problems around that. It's a problematic use of photography in many ways, but at the same time, photography is amazing at the amount of rich detail that it can capture. But that, as I'm sure we'll come on to talk about, that rich detail has little real meaning unless you have the context around that. And that is where my interest in the Calvine case, I suppose, is applied.
So let's get into the Calvine case. And could you tell us how you first became involved in it? When did you first hear about it, and what was your involvement in it?
Yeah, so I work with Dr. David Clark at the university, and the two of us are in this research group called the Center for Contemporary Legend, and we worked on a number of projects together. But David had never really talked to me much about the Calvine case, even though he was researching. I mean, he's been involved in researching it for probably about 12 or 15 years, at least. But in particular, I think he's been focusing on it for the last sort of 5 to 8 years, and he never really mentioned it. And then we'd kind of finished our teaching, and we're in that period where you're going through assessment and marking, where there's a little bit more freedom. I wasn't in the university very often, and he said, "I really want you to come in next." I think it was next Monday, because I'm going up to Scotland. I'm going to get something, going to bring it back. And I really need you to photograph it before I put it into the library. And we got to be really careful about this. It's really valuable. And he didn't really tell me what it was.
I mean, that's amazing. I would be so into any kind of interaction with that. Very cloak and dagger already.
It was, yeah. I mean, I would have gladly gone in and helped David with whatever it was, but it made it even more fascinating. And he told me a little bit about it, but not very much. So I turned up, And I booked the studio, and we went in, and I scanned the photograph, and I re-photographed it as well, because just to make sure we got the maximum resolution and the different versions. Scanning it flatbed is different to re-photographing the actual photograph. And he told me that he'd just collected this from Craig Lindsay, and he told me a bit of the background. But at that point, I knew nothing about the Calvine case whatsoever. I've got no background in ufology, although I've kind of had an interest in UFO photographs when you see them published. And so as I was photographing it and as I was scanning it, I'm holding the print, I'm looking at it, I'm saying, have you noticed, it's black and white, but it's on color paper. I wonder what's going on. That can't be an original print from a color negative, because he was telling me the originals were color. So I'm kind of, maybe there's been a copy made in between. And other things that became apparent looking at, it's slightly cropped because it's 10:8 format, and a 35mm frame is not 10:8 format. And I began to sort of mention these things that came to light. And he said, well, would you mind writing those up for me? Could you, write up your thoughts on it, have a look at it, take the scans away, have a look in more detail, and write up your thoughts. And I kind of got a bit involved and ended writing quite an extensive report, over 30 pages. And I got involved at looking at barbed wire, because it looks to be a barbed wire fence, and what the spacing of the barbed wire is, and various different aspects of the print, which I then gave to him like a week later. Unbeknownst to me, this was then going to become quite important information in the story that he then wrote for the Daily Mail, which was published in mid-August. Was it the 12th or the 13th of August? I think it was published online on the 12th and maybe in print on the 13th. And then, of course...
sorry, now, when you first saw the photograph and you saw what the content was, were you made aware of the context of the photograph before you saw it, or were you just presented the photograph and had no idea what it was going to be about?
I think he must have told me the basics of it, that this was a UFO sighting. And as we spent a couple of hours together copying it and talking about it. And so I think as I was looking at it, I was learning about the story behind it. And of course, he was quite fresh with the evidence from Craig Lindsay. Lindsay, he had interviewed him a number of times, but on that visit, he'd interviewed him again, and Lindsay had told him more about the story. So he was sharing that with me at the same time that I was viewing the photographs.
You must have sort of a feel for photographs because of your background. What were your first impressions?
Well, it was very, very intriguing, because normally, like I say, I've not been involved in ufology, but I've seen UFO photographs. I'm interested in the photograph as a form of evidence, and quite often photographs of UFO sightings are used as evidence of their reality. So what intrigued me was I looked at it and I didn't know what it was. And normally when you see a UFO photograph, you can kind of explain it in one way or another. It's a lot of the UFO photography in the 1950s is fairly easy to explain. It's an internal reflection in the camera lens. A lot of the early photographs that were published in the early 50s were kind of internal reflections, because you're pointing your camera up towards a bright light in the sky, and you get an equal and opposite reflection on the other side of the lens.
And of course, in the 50s, there was all of the scams, people taking pictures of lamps, people taking pictures of hats, people taking pictures of like whatever nonsense they've made.
And there's some famous British ones that David's actually investigated, some in quite very local to Sheffield, local to the university, where they were like little cutout UFOs, either stuck or painted on glass, which was held up in front of the camera.
Very sophisticated.
It's amazing that they were taken. I mean, these went down to the Ministry of Defence, and even as we now know, the Duke of Edinburgh and Prince Charles were fascinated in UFOs, and some of the people who took these photographs ended up meeting the Duke of Edinburgh, and sort of being wined and dined in London.
You had seen a bunch of forgeries, and you had seen a bunch of things which were obviously explainable, but then you looked at this one and you thought, okay, this is maybe a little bit different from those.
Yeah, there wasn't an instant, it didn't look like something hanging from the tree, and quite a few sort of UFO photographs immediately look like that. And there's the famous McMinnville photographs, the Trent photographs, which a number of investigators have fairly conclusively shown to be most likely hanging from the wires.
Right.
And they look like they're hanging from the wires. But this didn't look like that, and it doesn't look like it's on glass held in front of it. There's not an easy explanation. So I was intrigued, actually.
Okay, so you're already intrigued. You're already saying, okay, this is perhaps a bit different from some of the other many ones that I've seen.
Yeah.
So then what were some of the professional techniques that you used, that you applied to this to try to figure out what it was we're seeing in this photograph?
Well, that's where the Calvine case is quite difficult, because we don't have the negatives. So you're left with the print. So I can examine the print, and there's a lot of information you can learn from the print, and then you can examine the content of the image, and you can make measurements of the content, of the object in the sky, and the plane that we can see, and the fence, and I believe you can see barbed wire along the fence, and then you can measure the intervals of the barbs, which gives you a scale in the foreground, and then you know the length of a Harrier jet. Now, some people don't believe it's a Harrier jet. The MOD identified it as a Harrier jet, and other people have identified it as a Harrier jet. So you've got a scale in the background and a scale in the foreground, so you can begin to make some distance calculations. But the problem
unfortunately, at this point, I have to interrupt because you're talking about airplanes. And
okay.
To me, I mean, it is a bit blurry. It is quite a bit in the distance, this aircraft. But it does seem to resemble a Harrier jet to me. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm no expert on jets, but yeah, it's blurred.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we come to the blur in the photograph, but it appears to be movement blur. There are two ways in something could be blurred in a photograph. One is because it's out of focus. So the camera is either focused in front of it or behind it. And the other way in which something can be out of focus is if it was moving when the photograph was taken and the shutter speed was slow enough for the object to move during the exposure, then it's blurred. And the way focus blur looks in a photograph is different to how movement blur looks, because something's moving, so the blur in front and behind it is slightly different. Whereas if something's out of focus, the whole item is out of focus by a similar amount.
Okay.
Around the edges. So yeah, so you were asking about the plane. I'm not able to identify it as a Harrier. The MOD identified it as a Harrier. And basically what the MOD did, as far as we know, was their analysis would be along very similar lines to how I analysed it, which is really, they did have the negatives, so they could do more analysis. But, from the print, you can measure distances, you can get a scale, so you can figure out how far away the Harrier is. And then depending on where you then place the object, and this is where it just comes down to judgment. But, if you believe the object to be really in the near foreground, you could estimate a scale for it, a size for it. If you believe it to be roughly where the Harrier is, or in front of the Harrier, just behind the Harrier, you can estimate a scale for it.
The MOD, when you look at the files that were released, I mean, they had like an official response. This is how you should respond to the press. They didn't really want to get involved at all, but they knew it was going to become a story.
But the impression that I get is that the MOD wasn't so much interested in either supporting or debunking UFO stories. They just wanted to know if it had any national significance, if it was of national security significance. So they did take this quite seriously. They sent it to JARIC, or at the time was where images were analysed, and they analysed surveillance images going right back to the Second World War. And they analysed it. It was JARIC who said it was a Harrier, and they provided a report and a statement for the Minister of Defence to read in Parliament, because they thought there would be questions, because they believed the Daily Record was going to publish the story. So they prepared a report that just basically was very factual and just stated the facts. Now, it said that they believed it was a Harrier. They couldn't identify the object. And as far as they were concerned, no Harriers were recorded as flying in that area at that time. And that was basically it. Yeah, I wouldn't say that they were trying to quash the story. That came later, because what is missing... So the other thing to mention is that in this report, in this statement, they stated that the negatives have been returned to the Daily Record. Some people believe that they weren't. that they were destroyed, or that maybe they're still somewhere in the MOD. But I do believe the originals were probably sent back to the Daily Record, because David Clarke's interviewed, and I've read the interviews and listened to the recordings of a number of interviews he undertook with people who worked in the MOD, who won't go on the record. One of whom worked in DI 55, and DI 55 was the Department of Intelligence that would investigate UFO reports that were passed on to it by the UFO desk. So a UFO report would come into the UFO desk, which was called SEC AS A2, or sorry, SEC AS 2A, and it would come into the desk, and if they thought it was important enough, it would be passed up to DI 55. And so someone in DI 55 that David's interviewed basically said, we would return negatives because we were really worried about copyright claims.
Right. And that's such a good story for, I think, for conspiratorially minded people to hear. Because, of course, it's so easy to say, oh, these must have been like deliberately hidden or covered up, or even the witnesses have been like liquidated, the witnesses have been murdered, whereas so often the government is a massive bureaucracy.
Yeah.
And so often there's just some sort of bureaucratic explanation.
They've got to return the negatives because they don't have copyright in them, and they don't want anyone coming back at a later date, with some kind of claim.
Right. Because, I mean, aliens are kind of scary, but copyright lawyers are extremely scary.
Well, they are today. I'm not sure what they were like in 1990, but yeah. I think they probably were. Now, whether they definitely made prints from them, because Craig Lindsay states that he saw prints when he visited the MOD in sort of October, November, a little bit later, a month or two later, and they showed him prints from the 6 negatives. Where things might have disappeared is the two things. So I'm talking about context, and how important context is to learning more about what we're seeing in the photograph. So the context that we have is the information really that Craig Lindsay obtained from one of the witnesses. So the witnesses took the photographs or sent the photographs to the Daily Record. The Daily Record was intending to publish them, but they wanted a comment from the MOD. So they got in touch with the RAF press officer in Scotland, who was Craig Lindsay. Craig said, well, I can't make a comment on this unless I see a photo. So they sent him a photo in this envelope. Well, this isn't the original envelope. This is a facsimile of the envelope. So it's 10/8, slightly larger than 10/8 envelope from the Scottish Daily Record. And in the envelope, to go back to the facsimile, there was a print, a single print, and Craig asked them to send him the best, a copy of the best version. So the Daily Record made this copy and sent it to Craig. And when Craig received it, he saw the relevance of it and immediately produced a number of photocopies. He went upstairs. This is the story he tells. He went upstairs and produced a number of photocopies of that image. We can see here. These aren't the originals. These are copies that I made, but they're on the same color paper that he made them on. So photocopies in 1990 weren't particularly good. And so these are kind of grainy, blurry, and they've got lines across them. And then he faxed one of these photocopies to the MOD in London.
Now imagine at this point, if you're trying to do an analysis of an image, if you are having to deal with like a photocopied facsimile, at this point, the amount of information you can get from that must be severely limited.
Yeah, indeed. So Craig faxes the photo down to the MOD in London. When he gets back to his office, he says, and he's been quoted as saying this a number of times, the phone was ringing off the hook. It was really urgent, wanted to get in touch with him. So he picked the phone up and he said, we need the original negatives and you need to talk to one of the witnesses. So Craig gets off the phone and contacts the Daily Record and says, we need the original negatives sent to the MOD. So the Daily Record apparently got in touch with a witness and requested them to either send the negatives to them or send them straight to the MOD. And the Daily Record gave Craig the phone number for the witness. So Craig then phones this number that he's given. And at that point, he didn't know where this was going to take him. But it ends up being a hotel in Pitlochry. And he speaks to the person on the reception and they say, oh, yeah, we'll go get them for you. We don't know what the name was. We'll get them for you. They're working in the kitchen. And so this person comes, picks up the phone, and then tells Craig the story. Now, what we have from the MOD is the handwritten brief notes of the outline of the evidence of the story, but we don't have Craig's typewritten notes. That's what we need, because those typewritten notes will name the hotel, it will name the witnesses, it'll have much more detail of the story, and that's disappeared. So that was in the MOD, that was there in 1990, but that's disappeared. And the other thing that we don't have in terms of context is the report that Jarek produced. So the original negatives were sent to the MOD's investigative analysts, and they produced a report which was the basis of the answer that was prepared for the Minister of Defence. And so those two key things, along with any copies of the photographs that they made, that's what's missing.
Right. I mean, this sounds so familiar to Lee and I, because this is what we're dealing with all of the time. We have glimpses into something. We have shreds of something. We have redacted something. But we know that there is more information out there. And if we could just have access to those files, if we could have access to those memos, it would make all of the pictures so much clearer, no pun intended.
Yeah.
So based on the limited amount that you were working with, what is your professional opinion of this photograph?
I think there's two possible explanations. Some people have suggested that it's a distant peak peeking out of a cloud inversion. Well, that's not possible. It's just not feasible. I don't believe it's cloud inversion. What it could be is it could be something hanging. It could be something hanging without seeing the other negatives. I mean, the thing that, to my mind, is problematic there is my reading of the focus in the image. So I see the object in the sky as being the sharpest item in focus in the image. The fence in the foreground's out of focus, and the landscape in the background's out of focus. So the object in the middle is the sharpest item, and you can't have something in focus in front of it. Sorry, you can't have something out of focus in front of it and out of focus behind it with it in focus, unless it is in the middle distance. So it couldn't be in the foreground.
And then, of course, if it is in the middle distance, then that reduces the possibility that it's hanging from something. It also gives us maybe some kind of idea as to size.
Yeah. So I believe it could be. I want to revisit this and see if I can get more information from the image, because a number of people have criticised my interpretation, saying no, it's obvious it could be hanging in the foreground, and I agree it might be, but not in my reading of the focus in the picture. But I want to go back and look at that in more detail, and I've begun that process. But yeah, so it could be hanging in the near distance. If it's in the middle distance, then yeah, its scale is maybe 30 feet, 35 feet, depending on how you measure it. But again, here is where we get into difficulties, because to make these measurements of scale, we need to know what the focal length of the lens is. But we don't know. So I made measurements based on the assumption that it was either a 50mm lens or a 35mm lens. And that came out to it being 25 feet long, 35 feet long, something like that, if you believe it's in the middle distance. And like I say, some people don't believe that.
But as you say, there is some evidence for that because of the focus of the other things in the photograph.
I believe so. That's what I've been looking at. I've been looking at the edge sharpness of the object against the edge sharpness of the fence posts in the foreground. But I haven't completed that analysis yet. But my belief is that the blur on the edge sharpness of the fence posts is considerably more than the blur on the edge sharpness of the object, which would put it behind the fence. Okay. But I want to look at it in more detail. And there's a French, I think he's a French analyst who's done an analysis of the Trent photographs, where he does pixel stacking and looks at relative brightness of pixels, and is able to identify, he believes is able to identify a very, very slight variation in the brightness on a line sort of running up from the object in the Trent photographs, which he believes is the thread, which you can't see by the human eye, but if you do a very detailed analysis of different brightness across the image, you can kind of prove that. And one thing that's been suggested is we try and get him to do something like that with a Calvine photograph.
Because then, I mean, that would that pretty much definitively establish whether or not this is in fact a hanging object that is being dangled from some kind of arm?
Well, I think we're talking about folklore and mythology. I don't think you can ever definitively establish, because people believe, don't they? That even as evidence piles up, that explanation is probably not correct. Mm-hmm. If you believe in it, then yeah. So, but right. Yes, it would help. But again, this is where we come back to the difficulty of it being a copy print. So we don't have the original negative. So the original negative would have its own grain. But then if you rephotograph that onto another piece of film, which is what almost certainly has happened here, then you're adding another layer of grain.
Right.
So the grain that we're looking at might be the grain of the copy negative rather than the grain of the original. So that makes it difficult. And the other thing, just to mention, is that the copy image the grain in the copy image doesn't look 100% sharp. Mm-hmm. So I think when the copy was made, it was very slightly out of focus.
Lee, it's amazing to listen to this, because I feel like this photograph represents so much of the work that we have been doing over like the last decade, in that, again, it's tantalizing, it's interesting, but then there are things in between us and the truth, and there are distortions, and there are corruptions, and there are things that are missing. It's like, listening to this story, for me, it just reminds me of everything we've done.
Yeah, it's a visual metaphor of our life examining UFOs.
So I appreciate the care with which that you have been discussing all of this, and just your general approach. At this point, I'm going to give you a little bit more rope, because we're going to move into a more speculative area. Like, if I gave you a little bit of freedom, if I gave you a little bit of leeway, what do you think that this is a photograph of?
Okay, it could be a fake. Mm-hmm. I've got to accept it could be a fake. The evidence that I find in the photograph, I don't believe it is, but it could be. Everything that the witnesses told Craig kind of fits together. It all, it fits with other evidence. It fits with what the Daily Record told the MOD, and so on. So it doesn't feel like it's a fake, but it could be. If it's not, then I believe it is some kind of military black ops test aircraft of some sort.
And I mean, certainly the history of UFOs, Lee and I have talked about this for years. The history of UFOs is riddled with that kind of thing. The A-12, the SR-71, the U-2, the Avro car, like that is a fairly common thing to happen.
And the ridiculous number of designs and prototypes that never got off the drawing board, or prototypes that got into wind tunnel testing, and that it's not surprising that things might exist that no one's ever seen, that were just flown once, and then discounted.
But you mentioned mythology, and so I'd like to end with this, because this is another one of your interests. We talked about the photography aspect. Let's talk about the mythology aspect for a second. How does a photograph such as this one end up contributing to UFO mythology?
Well, because there are so many open questions. At the beginning I talked about, and as a photographer, I believe in the visual evidence that photographs provide. They provide amazing visual evidence, which is why they're used to identify us in passports, and they're used as scene of crime photographs. If you take a good set of photographs, then at a later date you can come back, you can make measurements, you can see things that you were overlooking at the time. So they're great at providing visual evidence. However, that evidence has little value without the context. So in the Calvine case, we don't have the original negs, we don't have the original prints, we don't know where it was taken, we don't know who took it. We think it might be this mysterious Kevin Russell, and we have tracked down a Kevin Russell who worked in BitLocker at that time, but he denies all knowledge of it. Maybe it is him, and he's got good reason for denying any knowledge of it, but we don't know. And there's all these sort of open questions which allow you to build your own narrative. They allow you to build your own folklore around it, and this is what happens. So I'm quite happy to say I don't know what the UFO, the Calvine UFO photograph shows us. there's lots of unknowns. And for me, that's what's fascinating about it. How far can photography go? And what can we learn from it? Because I'm not invested. I'd be as happy if it was a black ops plane as I would be if it was a fake. I don't know what I'd think if it was from outer space.
But what about the witnesses? What about the people who actually claim they saw this? What happened to them? Why did they never come forward? Is there something sinister there? Is there something suspicious there?
But someone that David interviewed from DI-55, or from the MOD, he's spoken to a number of people there off the record, said, well, we know why they haven't come forward. The photographers haven't come forward. Why not? Well, they were poachers.
Right.
I saw frames before the Calvine pictures of them posing with their kill.
And so again, because the fact that they haven't come forward has caused such speculation and wild speculation in exactly the way you would expect, in that they have been silenced by the deep state. They have been taken to some kind of like prison somewhere. They have been eliminated. And again, we might have a much more mundane explanation for this.
And I think it might have been the same source who said, well, someone did go up to speak to them and just sort of suggested they don't talk about it.
Right.
And I don't think, I mean, who knows? You don't know, but knowing how British bureaucracy works, that wouldn't be someone from DI-55. It wouldn't be someone from the intelligence agency. They might go up to Scotland to investigate, but they'd send someone across to have a chat with them. They would sort of suggest, well, we got these pictures of you poaching. Don't say anything about it.
Yeah, maybe.
And it's as simple as that. And that's what, an intelligence source has suggested. And whether that's true, who knows? Does poaching take place up there? We've had conflicting reports. People saying, "Oh no, we never see any poaching," and then other people saying, "Yeah, of course." People are up there poaching and trying to sell things to the hotels, perhaps.
And again, we see this sort of like cascading
exactly.
story on story on story, and then it all just contributes to ultimately this massive mythology.
But that's a really interesting, and this is where if we had the natives,
right,
and where are they? Would the MOD have destroyed them? Well, we do know that the MOD, if they have something that they don't want to be accessible, they don't necessarily destroy it. They just put it somewhere where you can't find it. And so freedom of information requests do not reach to MOD contractors. So if they store it with an MOD contractor, someone like BAE Systems, one of these companies that they work very, very closely with, that if it's stored there, if data or information or documents are stored there, then freedom of information requests don't get through to them. So when the MOD says we don't have any, we've released everything, they're telling the truth. So
right, in a sense.
They're not lying because they don't want to lie. So they're not lying. It's just that it's hidden somewhere else. So that's always a possibility.
Right.
And then the other thing that's interesting is Richard Grieve, Richard Grieve, who came forward and said that the Men in Black, one dark and rainy night, the Men in Black arrived at the hotel, at Fisher's Hotel in Pitlochry, and asked the two witnesses to step outside. And then they went outside, and after they'd been talked to, that was it. They disappeared and were never seen again. And Richard Grieve is a very entertaining witness. But what's interesting here, it'd be easy to dismiss his story as being ridiculous, perhaps. But Richard contacted David before David had published the original story. I think before he'd even got the full story from Craig Lindsay. And Richard said that the witnesses worked in a hotel in Pitlochry where he worked before that had been shared with the public. Mm-hmm. So if he had that knowledge at that point, before that knowledge had been shared publicly, and I think before even David knew about that, that gives some credibility to what he's telling. And then we have someone in the intelligence service who are saying that they did visit them. Then maybe there's some more truth to that story than you might believe.
Well, this is the thing about Men in Black stories. On the one hand, they are ridiculous. On the other hand, from our contacts, we have heard some pretty remarkable Men in Black stories that I believe.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, they turn out to be Air Force intelligence for the most part. But, like, there is something to that idea.
I think so. I mean, from what I've learned from listening to interviews and reading the transcripts of interviews with intelligence officers related to this case, the idea that they would, abduct someone, hold them secretly, murder them, or disappear them in any way seems ridiculous. But in a very British way, they'd kind of go along and say, old son, I think it's probably a good idea you don't talk to anyone about this.
Yeah, just a little bit of...
Yes, yeah.
No, exactly.
You know what I mean, don't you? You better not say anything about this.
Yeah, I mean, it's for the best.
And it's all very polite and very gentlemanly, but you're not going to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, it's been so great having you on. We appreciate your expertise and your caution and your care and your interest in this area. In fact, I think we would love to have you back on to continue talking about UFOs and photography and mythology, because it seems like there's like a rich English vein that perhaps we have been neglecting. And like, I know there are some very famous UK flying saucer incidents, and so we'd love to have you back sometime to talk more about this stuff.
I'd be very happy to come back.
I love talking to an expert. We don't have the kind of photo analysis expertise that Andrew has, so we were extremely fortunate to have been able to talk to him. That was. I mean, I found it fascinating and also very useful.
As a general point, this has happened many times when we've talked to people who really know what they're talking about, or when we've engaged their work in books and stuff. There's a certain quality that starts to emerge where you're like, oh, I can trust this person because they have thought about so many things that would never even occur to me. And
the other thing that you encounter in those situations is a cautiousness, which I appreciate.
Exactly. That too.
Like a hesitancy to start wildly speculate and a willingness to say, you know what? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know of this, or this is not my area.
Yeah. But you know what? I still don't know what it is.
Well, now that's what we've got to do now.
You want to talk about airplanes.
Now we've got to do a little bit of analysis here. So we've got a couple competing hypotheses for what this picture could be. And we talked about them in the interview. It could be a hoax.
Yeah,
it could be faked. It could be something dangling.
Yep.
It could be an example of secret tech that somebody was able to capture on film. Secret tech of the 1990s. Or it could be something else. Let's concentrate right now on the idea of it being secret tech, because I think it's one of the more interesting interpretations. I think it's also a very reasonable interpretation. It's something that we have seen in the past. As we talked about in the interview, this is something that has happened over and over and over again. You have some kind of new tech that the public doesn't know about. It's being tested. Somebody sees it. The rumors start to spread. Maybe some guys in black suits come out and suggest that you don't talk about it. And then next thing you know, you've got yourself like a flying saucer flap happening.
And we have, I think it was, I can't remember the date, mid-90s, I think a CIA report saying that about 50% of the best UFO sightings were misidentified secret aircraft technology, the U-2, the Oxcart, the
SR-71.
All the common suspects, I guess.
Right.
And so that's not unusual.
Yeah. So here's what I suggest we do to analyze this potential. Let's say that let's assume that the story that we're told from the hikers is true. Let's assume that the photograph is not faked. What could we tell from the story, and what could we tell from the photograph?
Okay.
Well, if it was secret tech, because of the story in the photograph, we have an idea of what it looked like and what flight characteristics it had. So it looks like a flattened diamond. There's no obvious means of propulsion or lift, which for something in the sky, that's going to raise some questions. It has no wings. It has no rotors. It has no jet. It has no rocket exhaust. Like, there doesn't seem to be any opening. In what we can see from the photograph, there doesn't seem to be an opening. In what we can tell from the description of the hikers, there doesn't seem to be any sound. And so if you have a rotor, if you have an engine, if you have a jet, if you have a rocket, all of those things are going to make sound. It was able to hover and travel straight up in the air, if we're to believe the story. And that is extraordinary, although not as extraordinary as you might think. The other aircraft in that photograph was a Harrier jet. And the Harrier jet is also able to do those maneuvers, which is unusual for a jet plane. It can hover, it can go backwards, it can go straight up.
Makes quite a racket though doing that, doesn't it?
It makes an immense racket because what it does is it has a large engine with adjustable exhaust on the side of its fuselage that can point backwards like a normal jet plane, but they could also point down, which makes it go up in the air.
Right. Okay.
Or they can even point forwards to back it up. So the Harrier uses vectored thrust. So while it can perform these very strange maneuvers, and when you see one in real life, it looks weird. It makes a lot of noise. It has conventional wings, and there's a completely understandable explanation for why it can do these things. That noise is evidence of the mechanism through which it can fly. So are the exhaust ports. And so if this Calvine UFO is able to do the same maneuvers, it would have had to have been much more advanced than the Harrier jet. Now, the Harrier jet was designed in the 1960s. But basically, this thing, if it is a bit of tech, it would have been as further advanced from the Harrier in 1990 as the A-12 spy plane was from the aircraft of its time period when it flew in 1962. Like this thing would have had to have been just an absolute massive leap ahead if we're to believe the story.
Yeah. Okay. I'll add a bit of data to this potentially being military tech as well. Why does the Daily Record not publish the story?
Mm-hmm.
Right. This seems consistent with the kind of, uh-oh, we got a call from the MOD saying, no. This is, sorry, our bad, but this is not to be published. So
Mm-hmm.
that's interesting that they don't ever publish those pictures. I think it's also noteworthy that the two hikers apparently are visited by what might be men in black. It affects their personal life, apparently, like they become more itinerant. They don't have a place of residence anymore. They start, okay. So
Again, if we are to believe that story that was
Sure.
told by one of the witnesses that claimed to have known those guys. But
Yeah, so
again,
I'm
but
just-
that story isn't an unusual story. We see that over and over again in the history of UFOs.
Yeah.
We see people coming forward and saying, "Hey, I saw a UFO," and then we see their lives kind of going poorly after that.
Sure. Yeah.
Like it's,
For
I mean,
all
John
kinds of
Keel did a
reasons.
bunch of work on this.
Yeah.
For all sorts of reasons, exactly. So all of this means it's like, okay, maybe this was secret tech. And of course,
Now-
there's rumors of a top secret project in the 80s that was going to replace the SR-71 spy plane.
Uh-huh.
And its code name was Aurora.
And that's been linked with this, but I feel like, will want to do an entire episode on an airplane related potential
Absolutely.
conspiracy. Okay.
Yeah, we'll have
So
to
we
do an
just-
entire episode on Aurora.
We just put that out there. I'm
Mhm.
curious though, as an airplane expert that you are, is the Harrier the kind of jet you send to intercept something that you don't know in the sky? Is that your first line of defense? Or is it unusual that it's the Harrier that's scrambled and not something else?
I mean, the Harrier was not the main interceptor of the RAF at that time period because the Harrier wasn't particularly fast. It was maneuverable. It could go straight up and down. It could do all sorts of interesting things. But what you want from your interceptor is something that gets to the object in a big hurry. So at the time, the main interceptor for the RAF would have been the Tornado jet
Okay.
fighter.
Okay.
Also, the fact that, according to the MOD, there wasn't an official Harrier in that area at that time, a Harrier in the area, suggests either the MOD is lying about that, which is, I suppose, possible, or it wasn't an RAF Harrier.
Okay.
There
So
were,
could it have been another type of could it have been the more
It could have
common
been-
interceptor?
it could have been, no, it definitely wasn't a Tornado.
Definitely not
But
that.
but what it could have been is a Harrier that wasn't being run by the RAF, but a Harrier that was being run by, say, British Aerospace,
Okay.
the firm that was producing the Harrier,
Okay.
because they would also have Harriers that they ran as test beds and things like that.
Mhm.
And so this also led people to think, okay, if it's not an RAF Harrier, if it's like a corporate Harrier, was this part of like a test run that they were doing in the area? And this is something that's very common, that like aircraft firms will have their own planes that they use as spotter planes and as test beds and things like that.
Wouldn't you though need to alert the RAF, for example, of the fact that you are now going to fly in their airspace?
I mean, you would, but it would also provide the RAF with plausible deniability. They could
Right.
say, yeah, there's no RAF Harriers in the area.
Right.
Hmm.
Okay.
So
On the
again,
other,
and all this stuff has precedent. We do have
Mhm.
one advantage, we have a disadvantage, and then we have a copy of a copy of a photograph and a couple stories. But we also have a considerable advantage. It's 30 years ago.
Okay.
And this is always useful to us. Because here's the thing, if it was some sort of top secret tech, I think that there's a potential that at this point we would know about it.
Because
If we look at precedent, if we look at the A-12, unbelievably top secret bananas spy plane that could
yeah,
do things that nobody could even imagine at the time, 3 times the speed of sound, 100,000 feet in the air. 30 years after that thing was unbelievably top secret, flying out of Area 51 and covered in misinformation and disinformation. 30 years after that, common knowledge.
yeah.
Any kid can have like a model airplane of it. It's in movies, it's in TV shows, it's in documentaries, it's in
Because
books.
the point of secret tech is that eventually it stops being secret because you need to deploy it in the field. And
Mhm.
once you deploy it in the field, it's not a secret anymore. I mean, you might not necessarily give the specs away, but the fact that you have these capabilities is something that is now visible to anybody with a camera. And so I guess the argument, as I understand it, Nathan, that you're making is since this happened over 30 years ago now, it should have been time that this, and there have been a number of opportunities to, like, there have been theaters of war since then, that there have been opportunities for us to see something like this in action. And you're saying that we haven't seen anything like this.
Yeah, there's still nothing that we've seen in the field like this. We have seen all sorts of weird new tech, things like drones,
Yeah,
new satellites. Like we have seen a bunch of new stuff, but we haven't seen any weird diamond-shaped things that can hover and make no noise.
right. Yeah.
So 30
Okay.
years after this incident, we still have no official tech in the public that resembles what was photographed or described.
So, so it could be secret tech that maybe didn't work out, maybe wasn't ever deployed. But what else? I mean, we also don't have a lot to go on to suggest that this is clearly the thing that we see in the photograph. So, what other possible explanations are there?
Well, again, could be hoax, and it could be something else. That's
Okay.
basically what we have. We hoax, secret tech, something else.
Now, I was reflecting on the grifters and the hoaxers and the scammers. And generally or often what you get is an Adamski character who tries to make money off of it. Now, in this case, we don't have that. So we have the two people who initially took the photos who have not come forward, who are not doing the Bob Lazar, Joe
They're not,
Rogan
yep,
podcast
they're
tour.
not out there
They're
doing the tours. They're not doing the speaking engagements.
they're not
They're
going
not
to
trying to
UFO
sell some kind of
conferences.
tech. They're not trying to sell anything.
Now, it's very possible that they were scammers, and maybe even this kind of like got too real too quick.
They got spooked and they're like, this scam is getting away from
This
us.
is not
Maybe,
fun.
yeah, let's back off.
Like, you're out with a buddy, you've maybe had a little too much to drink, and you're like, ha ha ha, let's take some photos of this thing we've got on a string and send it to the local newspaper to see if they'll publish it. And next
What a
thing you
laugh.
know, Ministry of Defense, the Royal Air Force, they're on the phone, people are visiting you, they want the negatives, they want to know what the hell happened. As like, oh
I think I
no,
may have gotten in over my head here.
that wasn't funny after all.
I think ultimately, here's what we have with this photograph and this story. It's not the thing that is going to get us where we want to go.
No,
Because the,
exactly.
because where we want to go is the truth. And is so often the case, this isn't going to get us to the truth. But here's, I think, what it can do. I think it still moves us further forward. I think look what it's done. Look what this photograph has done. It has, for one thing, it's gotten us in contact with Andrew Robinson. Fascinating guy. Love to use him again. He's got some really interesting insights. Two, it has propelled us forward into new areas of study. Now let's look into Aurora. Now let's look at some of the other things that were happening in the 1980s with tech. It's opened up the world of UK UFO sightings. And so, as frustrating as it is that we're always in this situation where we don't have enough information. It is, I do feel like we're getting somewhere.
Hmm.
We haven't arrived, but I feel like we are slowly getting somewhere. And I feel like that's what this picture does for us. Let's just keep moving forward. Let's keep trying to figure this out. Let's keep working.